There was a time in Britain when childhood sounded very different to how it does now, not because parents were louder or harsher, but because words were used in a far more direct way. Adults didn't explain themselves endlessly, didn't negotiate every rule, and didn't stop to consider how a sentence might land emotionally in 20 years' time. They spoke from experience, habit, and a quiet belief that children were tougher than they realized. These phrases weren't shouted. They weren't meant to humiliate or frighten. Most of them were said calmly, sometimes while stirring a pot on the cooker, folding laundry, or standing at the front door with a coat already on. They were part of everyday British life, passed down without much thought because they had always worked before. Today, many of these sentences would cause outrage. They'd be clipped, shared, debated, and dissected. But back then, they were just said. Heard once, understood immediately, and remembered forever. Number 1. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. This phrase has become almost legendary. It echoed through kitchens, school corridors, and back gardens across Britain. It wasn't always delivered in anger. Sometimes it was said with a sigh, sometimes with tired patience, sometimes with the calm certainty of a parent who had reached the end of a long day. Crying wasn't seen as something to unpack or explore. It was something to finish. Adults believed children needed to learn control early because the world outside the home would not always be gentle. The sentence wasn't meant as a literal threat. It was a signal. Enough tears, enough noise, time to steady yourself and carry on. Today, the phrase sounds shocking, but for generations, it represented a belief that resilience came from restraint, not reassurance. Number 2, children should be seen and not heard. This sentence defined an entire era of British upbringing. At dinner tables, in waiting rooms, and during visits to neighbors, children knew exactly what was expected. You sat quietly, you listened, you waited until spoken to. Interrupting adults was almost unthinkable. This wasn't about cruelty, it was about manners. Adults believed children learn behavior by observing it, not by dominating conversations. A quiet child was considered polite, respectful, and well brought up. Today, children are encouraged to speak freely and express opinions. Back then, silence itself was considered a skill, one that prepared you for adult society. Number 3, you're fine. Walk it off. Falls were common. So were scrapes, bruises, and the occasional bloody knee. The response was rarely dramatic. A quick glance, a moment's pause, and then those familiar words. Pain was treated as temporary, something to overcome, not dwell on. Adults trusted children to recover quickly and believed that too much attention only made things worse. Modern parenting might call this emotional minimization. Back then, it was confidence. Confidence that children were sturdier than they looked. Number 4, don't answer back. This sentence ended conversations instantly. It didn't invite discussion or explanation. It reminded children that questioning authority too far crossed the line. Parents believed respect was foundational. You could ask questions, but once a decision was made, it stood. Answering back wasn't seen as confidence or curiosity. It was seen as disrespect. Today, children are encouraged to challenge and explain themselves. Back then, knowing when to stop talking was considered just as important as knowing how to speak. Number 5, because I said so. There was no follow-up, no justification, no debate. Authority was assumed, not defended. Parents and teachers didn't feel the need to explain every decision. Their role was to decide, and your role was to accept it. This phrase wasn't meant to silence forever. It was meant to establish boundaries. Children learned early that adulthood came with responsibility and that not every rule required a detailed explanation. In today's world of discussion and choice, the sentence feels abrupt, but once it was simply how structure worked. Number 6, don't be so soft. Often said gently, sometimes with a small smile, this phrase reflected Britain's long-standing admiration for stoicism. Being soft wasn't a failure, but it was something to outgrow. Adults believed the world was demanding, and children needed to be prepared for disappointment, criticism, and discomfort. Toughness wasn't about cruelty, it was about readiness. Today, sensitivity is nurtured and protected. Then, strength was quietly expected. Number 7. Life isn't fair. This sentence was delivered without bitterness. It wasn't meant to dismiss feelings, but to ground expectations. Adults believed children needed to understand early that fairness was not guaranteed and that disappointment was part of life. Rather than shielding children from unfairness, parents prepared them for it. The idea was simple. Learning this lesson early would make later disappointments easier to handle. Today, fairness is often explained and negotiated. Back then, it was accepted as a basic truth. Number 8. I don't care what other kids are doing. This phrase shut down comparisons instantly. It didn't matter who else was allowed to stay out later, skip homework, or take risks. Parents believed character was built by standing firm, not by following the crowd. You weren't raised according to trends or peer pressure, but by rules that didn't bend easily. In a world now dominated by social comparison, this sentence feels almost radical. Back then, it was standard. Number 9. You'll thank me later. At the time, this phrase meant nothing. Bedtimes felt unfair, chores felt endless, restrictions felt unnecessary. Adults spoke from experience. They believed discipline had delayed rewards, ones you wouldn't understand until adulthood arrived. Some children did thank them later, some didn't, but the phrase captured a belief in long-term character over short-term comfort. Number 10. There are starving children who'd love that. This phrase appeared at dinner tables across Britain. Plates were cleared, food was not wasted, complaints were met with this reminder. Sometimes exaggerated, but always effective. It came from a generation shaped by rationing, war, and real scarcity. Adults believed gratitude was something you learned, not something you were born with. Today, we talk about healthy relationships with food. Back then, finishing your dinner was a moral expectation. Number 11. Big boys don't cry. This sentence carried quiet weight. It wasn't shouted, it was stated. Emotion was acceptable in very young children, but maturity, especially for boys, meant control. The message wasn't that feelings were wrong, but that they should be managed privately. Modern views have changed dramatically, but for decades this phrase shaped how emotions were handled and hidden. Number 12. Wait till your father gets home. This phrase didn't always mean punishment. Sometimes it meant discussion, sometimes disappointment, sometimes consequences, but it always carried gravity. Fathers were often seen as the final authority, not because mothers lacked power, but because roles were clearly defined. Mothers ran households, managed days, and provided constant care. This phrase simply acknowledged hierarchy, not fear. Today, it sounds ominous. Then, it was simply part of family structure. Looking back, these phrases weren't just words. They were part of a cultural framework that shaped how children understood authority, emotion, and responsibility. They didn't come from cruelty, but from a belief that the world was demanding and children needed to be ready for it. We don't need to bring them all back. Times change and understanding grows, but remembering them helps us understand where we came from and why certain sentences still echo in our minds decades later. Which one do you remember hearing most? Let us know in the comments below, because these memories are part of our shared story.
Learn Quran online with Hassan al-Basri Quran Academy. We teach Quran online with Tajweed through Skype, Zoom, and WhatsApp all over the world. We offer Quran for beginners, Quran with Tajweed, Qiraat course, Quran translation, Quran memorization, Tafsir course. Learn with qualified expert and trained teachers. So what you waiting for? Join us. Visit over website, HassanalBasriQuranAcademy.com.